Hello and welcome to Critter Literature. This is a podcast that explores how animals are portrayed in books, film, and popular culture, and how those stories have shaped our relationship with animals and broader ideas about animal rights over time. In this episode, I have invited Michael Budkie of SAEN, Stop Animal Exploitation Now, and we're going to be talking about the work of Tom Regan. And I was really happy for you to bring up Tom Regan because I've always looked at the difference between Peter Singer and Tom Regan, and it's difficult sometimes to understand the differences and the philosophical approaches that they've taken. First of all, I just would like you to explain a little bit about how your voyage started in animal rights and how SANE started.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you, David, for having me today. And my involvement in animal rights is something that I never expected to happen. I was a student inside the University of Cincinnati getting a degree in animal health technology. And at that time, back in the 1980s, been around for a while, that program was run by the same veterinarians who supervised the animal research facility. And in fact, the program was actually held, most of the classes, the lectures, the labs, all of it was pretty much held within the medical sciences building, which is where all of their animal research is performed. And a lot of people may not understand that getting the degree that I was in as an animal health technician, you essentially do one of two things as employment. You either work for a veterinarian in private practice, or you work as an animal care technician inside a research facility. My thought was always to work with a veterinarian, but because there is that other possibility, you take classes that potentially teach you things that are part and parcel of performing animal research. Personally, I have a lot of extremely horrific memories from when I was there. Not that I would suggest that the university was doing anything illegal, but it's just because of the way that animal research is performed. If you walk down a hall and look into the wrong room, you may see something like a rat getting beheaded, because that was one way of obtaining tissue samples. Or the incident that really drove home the realities of the situation involved a dog. We had several canine companions at the time, and there was one named Scruffy, who was a black and white terrier mix, very coarse hair, and she was very shy. She would only come to see you with a toy in her mouth, and she was the kind of dog, her personality was such that if you took one step toward her, she would probably back up two steps and go away from you. Well, at one point, there was a dog that came in that the resemblance to our Scruffy was just uncanny. If I didn't know better, I would have suspected they were litter mates, down to the coloring, the personality, and everything else. And so, as you can imagine, I became very attached to this other Scruffy. I would take him special treats, take him on walks as much as I could. And then the horrible thing happened. I went in to see him one day, and he was just gone, and he never came back. And I did a little bit of research and found out the kind of project that he was being used in, and it was a terminal study. It was something where they were used in a surgical procedure and never woke up. And that really very much drove home for me that there was no difference between the animals at the laboratories at the University of Cincinnati, or for that matter, any other laboratory, versus the dogs that are in our homes. And especially in this case, the two animals were so similar. I graduated from the program in '86. So I've been doing this kind of work for roughly 40 years now. And the rest of the program that I completed in 86, the AHT program, had a number of other things that were part of the classes. I had one experience where I was learning how to stomach tube rodents, which is basically you have what they call a ball syringe because it uses liquid in just the same as one where you're actually injecting into a blood vein or a blood vessel or and doing an IP injection. But this is for depositing liquids into the stomach of a rat or a mouse. And the very first time that I did this, I threaded the ball syringe incorrectly. And instead of putting the liquid substance into this rodent's stomach, I succeeded in going into the lungs and suffocated the animal instantaneously. One of the things that disturbed me the most about this, other than having the animal, due to my own inexperience, die in my own hand, was that the teacher and the people supervising the class just made a joke out of it. They drew a picture of a rodent on a small piece of paper with a circle with a slash through it and taped it on the table in front of where I was working. And then I think, well, there were two other times that really forced me to see things without any barriers anymore. We had to write a paper and do a presentation to the faculty and the rest of the students. And we chose our own topic, and I chose animal rights in relation to animal-based research. And this is where I came into contact with one of Tom Regan's early books, All That Dwell Therein. There was an essay in there on what his moral views on animal experimentation were, and reading his work and learning about how he talked with regard to animals, about them having or being subjects of a life and having their own needs, and how they acted in such a way that their lives mattered to them, that this all demonstrated so clearly to me that it was utterly immoral to do things that treated animals as though they were inanimate objects and they could be cut up or destroyed as a matter of a human whim.
Right.
And that led to one other thing when I was there, which is something I don't discuss a tremendous amount. I was at school on one Friday, and there was a new set of dogs that came in. They were always held in what they referred to as the quarantine area for the first 2 weeks to make sure they weren't carrying any diseases. And there was a dog that came in that was pure white, and the eyes of this dog reminded me for all the world of a baby seal. And something kind of snapped inside me, and I decided they weren't getting this one. And so I waited around until a little bit later in the day, clipped a leash on the dog, and walked him out the front door. And the only regret I have about that is that I didn't do it with more animals when I was there.
The quote that Reagan says is, when it comes to animals, what we are witnessing is not biology, but a biography. And that rang so true to me when I was looking at these essays and researching Tom Regan, because I was very much aware of him, but Peter Singer always kind of rises to the front for some reason, and maybe because his book is labeled Animal Liberation, so therefore we all gravitate towards that, and both are important works of literature, but or philosophy. Uh,
I read Animal Liberation, but I've never used Singer's philosophy in anything that I did, because utilitarianism has an inherent problem. It
mhm.
doesn't look at the rights of the individual.
Right. Right.
If you use utilitarianism correctly, you could make an effective argument saying, if we took the lives of these 5 rats and it actually generated useful information that would help thousands of people that have this pathology, you could make a utilitarian argument that that was acceptable,
Yes.
because utilitarianism posits that the animals have their own interest and that those interests need to be considered.
Mhm.
Whereas a more of an individual rights philosophy says these individual animals have rights and those rights may not be violated,
Mhm.
period. It's very much like the individual rights talk that you see in documents such as Declaration of Independence. That document talks about the unalienable rights of individual people.
Mhm.
Well, I would argue that those kind of thoughts could be applied to individual animals as well.
Could you expand a little bit more about the difference between welfarist and abolitionist?
Welfarist reforms to animal experimentation involve doing things like making for larger cages, making sure the cages are cleaned properly, making sure that uh, pain relievers are used. They have the tendency, in my opinion, to make things like animal research more acceptable, because they remove some of the things that are people's objections to animal research. Whereas abolitionism states flat out that animal research can never be acceptable, simply because it is a extremely basic violation of the rights of the individuals that are used as research subjects. And I have always personally taken an abolitionist approach. The goal of Stop Animal Exploitation Now, SAEN, the organization of which I am one of the founders, our goal is not to put welfarist reforms in place. Our goal is to eliminate animal research. And that's our goal for multiple reasons. Obviously, we consider animal research to become or to be considered entirely unethical. But at the same time, animal research is extremely, if not entirely, unscientific. If you wanted to learn how to repair a car, you wouldn't start with a lawnmower. You would start with a car.
Right.
And in the same way with human beings, the proper study of human medicine is the human body. And especially with the current technology we have now, trying to generalize from a rat or a mouse to a human being is just so much scientific nonsense, when you can use something like organ on a chip technology or 3D bioprinting to produce a human organoid, where you can look at something that is actual human tissue and you don't have to somehow get across in species differences, which there really is no way to get around those. But what we found in our work is that there are many other very significant problems with the way that animal research is performed. We obtain documents from the federal government every year where failures to comply with federal regulations are reported. And we obtain about 1,000 of those. And I read through every single one of them personally. And what we see is that even if any of this animal research ever had the potential to produce useful information, it is performed so poorly that it removes any possibility of useful data coming out of it. One of the things that the general public doesn't understand is that animal research is based on following approved protocols. In other words, scientists look at the protocols before projects are ever started. And the results of these experiments can only ever be published if the protocols are followed.
Mhm.
Well, the problem is that of those 1,000 reports that we see every year, the most common violation is relevant to failure to follow the approved protocols.
Mhm.
And if you're not following the approved protocols, if you're not performing the experiments in a way that was examined by scientists, then technically you can't even get the data published.
Right, right. And what resonated with me is I saw you speak at animal rights conference probably in the late 90s, and you were saying that they had sent a cage through the cleaning process, and a monkey, I think, was killed, or some other animal that was in a laboratory. And if you can't trust these folks to make sure those animals are taken care of and not put to death unnecessarily, how can you trust them for any valid information and consistent information?
Well, yes, and I mean, there's one case that we're dealing with right now where a rodent was supposed to be getting euthanized, and typically the first step in that is use of a CO2 chamber where it essentially deprives the animal of oxygen. And then the next step is they are supposed to do a secondary method of euthanasia to make certain that it was actually performed and that the animal is actually dead. And the reason they try to make sure that two methods are used is because after that secondary method is performed, typically they take the animals and put them into plastic bags and put them in freezers for later disposal. Well, I cannot tell you how many times we have gotten documents where the violation was that they found living animals in carcass freezers. But in that process, you're also supposed to be very certain that the animal is dead after the first approach is used and before the second one is done, just as a safeguard. Well, we're dealing with something where the principal investigator was so incompetent that they did not make sure that that first euthanasia was complete. The second euthanasia was supposed to be a thoracotomy, which is essentially cutting open the chest cavity. The issue that was brought up here is that when they began to make the incision to do the thoracotomy, the animal started moving.
Mm. Mm.
And I don't mean to be flippant when I say this, but if these principal investigators cannot even kill an animal correctly, how can we believe anything they do is in any way remotely like science?
Hmm. It's bad science, and it's bad for the animals, and it's bad for us.
The only reason animal research goes on is because people make money doing
I
it.
was going to say that I was going to segue into the profit margin issues that, people are, even
Have,
the folks that work in the laboratories are not, they're tossed aside also, like the trauma and the psychological effects on them. I'm sorry,
oh,
go ahead. I was overspeaking you.
that's all right. Well, have you ever heard of something called indirect costs?
I believe so. Yeah, but expand.
The way it works is that for every grant that the federal government or any other entity issues, there's the actual grant amount itself, and then there's something that's added on that's called indirect costs. That's supposed to be for things like paying utility bills and keeping the buildings cleaned and taking the garbage out, things that are not directly part of the experimentation.
Mhm.
Well, every research facility has its own indirect cost rate. I've seen them as low as 40%, and in some cases, I've seen them well over 100%. And what that means, to keep the math simple, let's talk about a $100,000 grant. If it's a 40% indirect cost rate, that means that $100,000 grant just became a $140,000. And if it was a 100% indirect cost rate, that $100,000 grant just became a $200,000 grant.
Mhm.
Well, grants are very rarely that small anymore.
Mhm.
I rarely see a grant that's less than $350,000 anymore. They do exist, but they're much less common. And so the other thing that's important to know about these indirect costs is the way they're spent is unrestricted. In other words, the research facility can do with that indirect cost money whatever they like. And I remember one case in particular where a university was using indirect cost money to put fresh flowers at the chancellor's office every day. Doesn't sound to have much to do with science, does it?
Mm. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And my personal experience, I used to live in Seattle and we were trying to stop the expansion of the animal testing labs and they put it underground. And it's like, you wonder, like, what's the motivation? It's purely profit. It's purely profit because there's so many other advancements that you could put money into.
Well, and what you mentioned about where they were putting that laboratory brings up another issue about animal research. The fondest desire of every animal researcher and every laboratory that I'm aware of is to fly under the radar.
Mhm.
They do not want the public to know what's going on inside their facilities.
Mhm.
And so that's why you see things like animal laboratories being built underground, or we very often see reports that are written and sent to the federal government. Uh, One of the words at the top of the form will be confidential, which ignores the fact that once it gets to the federal government, it's subject to Freedom of Information Act and anybody can get it. But, you know, um, the animal research industry, and it is very much an industry, does not want the public to know what's going on. And that's why we have taken the approach of taking that supposedly confidential paperwork and publicizing it to the nth degree.
Mhm.
And that's why I feel we've been successful at ending animal research in many ways, because the research facilities can't stand the light of day being shown upon what they do.
You guys were really one of the groundbreaking groups to start this work.
Well, we have been involved very early on. Uh, Personally, we got involved on the my wife and I were the co-founders of SAEN. We got involved on the local level back all the way in '86. We ended up directing a campaign that targeted a head injury research project on cats
Mhm.
that was being done at the university I had just graduated from. And in about a year and a half, we were successful in forcing the project to be terminated. And we've had many successes ever since then. One of the biggest successes that I'm very proud of is we were able to force the closure of the Santa Cruz biotech facility in California. And another result of our campaign was that Santa Cruz Biotech paid the largest USDA fine in history. That was $3.5 million. Usually a pretty serious USDA fine is something more like 50,000.
Wow.
Nowadays, there are even issues with them with the USDA's ability to uh, impose fines. But the Santa Cruz Biotech facility was in California was actually closed, and we've had similar successes in other areas. We were the primary driving force behind the closure of the New England Primate Research Center that was back around 2013.
Mhm.
But we've also had successes in other areas that no one else is even trying. We were successful at getting a scientific journal to retract an article because the principal investigator had lied about what laboratory they were affiliated with. We were able to get a principal investigator at the University of Pennsylvania convicted of research misconduct because they had lied in their publication. And then there was a researcher at the University of Michigan who, after we filed a research misconduct complaint, all of a sudden decided it was time to retire.
And good riddance. I have this one quote by Tom Regan that says, "The fundamental wrong is the system that allows us to view animals as our resources, here for us to be eaten, surgically manipulated, or exploited for sport or money." I think we rationalize so many uses of animals when
Oh,
there
sir,
really is no
there's
rationalization.
no legitimate use of an animal that considers them to be property because sentient beings, whether we're talking about human beings or animals, should never be considered property. They are, and this is something that Regan said, they are ends in and of themselves and not a means.
Mhm.
So they're not tools, they're not models, they're living sentient beings, and they should be treated that way.
Right. And my experience is the reason why I'm really interested in vivisection, anti-vivisection, is that I adopted some rats, baby rats, like maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I realized how socially and emotionally complex they were. And the fact that, laboratories can just use them like ordering pieces of paper with no oversight or very little oversight was just such a mind-boggling idea to me when you think of the quantity of animals and little beings that are being used.
Well, rats and mice, especially, there is even less oversight
Mhm.
than with many other species because the majority of species in laboratories are covered by the Animal Welfare Act.
Mhm.
However, rats, mice, and some other species are actually excluded from the definition of the word animal as far as the Animal Welfare Act is concerned. Although I do want to point out that we've had some very good successes within the last 4 or 5 years of even ending studies that involved rats and mice. There was one going on at a laboratory in South Carolina that involved the use of electric shock. And just because we exposed what was going on and how the National Institutes of Health, or the Guide for the Care and Use of Animals in Laboratories, how those standards were being violated, the project was closed down. And so if there's anything that I want your listeners to understand is how effective we can be and how much we have the ability to have an extremely concrete impact on animal research. I believe we're going to see many more very significant changes to animal research in our lifetime, and it would not surprise me if we saw an end to the use of animals in laboratories in our lifetimes.
I
There's so
really
much better technology
And I
out there.
really hope so. And a good example is this recent beagle rescue where it was brought to light that all these beagles were being tortured. And I think folks could look towards a beagle and see their own dog within their household and make that leap that I would not want my dog to be experimented on. Therefore, these poor beagles should not be raised and used as things to be experimented on. It's
Well,
it's
that's the same kind of connection that I made initially in the laboratories at University of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
There was that there was literally that other dog that was The only difference I was ever able to find between the two dogs was gender.
Yeah. Yeah.
Short of that, it would not surprise me if they were a brother and sister. And the the walls that tore down for me mentally and philosophically led to so many other things.
Mhm. Isn't that incredible? Certain people have that sort of breakthrough and the rest don't. And the most astounding um thing that I've come across in my adult life is that why some of us can make that leap and some of us can't. And the dissonance that happens within folks' own minds.
Well, I think a lot of people, they're not open to that kind of change. When they're confronted with something like that, they just don't want to know because it forces them to take actions that they don't want to take. Personally, when I became concerned about the animal research issue, that was the only animal related issue I was thinking about. The concept that I would have to change my diet, change the clothes I wore or didn't wear, and so many other areas didn't even occur to me initially. And we became vegan back in '86, not because people had convinced us of how bad farm animals were treated. We became vegan primarily as a matter of consistency because it seemed extremely hypocritical to be going and picketing a university about the use of cats in an experiment and then to go home and eat part of a cow for dinner.
Right, right.
And you're
Makes,
right, some people just never make that connection.
mhm.
And, veganism is a very important thing, but I've always thought that as a movement, we should also allow individuals to be involved if they haven't made that jump yet. Because I remember a number of people that at one point were very active against the animal research issue, but hadn't made the change of altering their diet. And I'm concerned that we lost a lot of those people, and a movement the size of the animal rights movement can't afford to be losing people in large numbers. We're talking about the difference between welfarist versus abolitionist approaches to things. I have always thought that one of the biggest problems with welfarism is that it tends to make things that are horrific abuses to be more palatable for people, because if this horrific procedure is being performed on animals, but we give them pain relieving drugs before and after, then it's got to be okay, right? Well, the pain relieving drugs don't make it any less wrong, and they don't change the fact that you're treating a sentient being as though he or she were an inanimate object. As long as animals act as though their life matters to them, in other words, as long as they act in a way such that they try to protect themselves, whether it's holding on to a food source or protecting their territory or any of so many other kinds of behaviors that show they are trying to remain alive, then that proves in and of itself that they are not objects and can't be treated as such. One of the other kind of things that people don't understand about animal research is, and see, this is one of the issues that has kept me working in this area for this long, is that depending on the species of animal you're talking about, this is not a short-term thing for them. non-human primates in particular can live for decades. And we have seen where, from looking at the records, you could tell that certain species of primates ended up being used in the same experiment, for example, in something involving addictive drugs, for a very long period of time. And this has an impact on them that may not happen with other species of animals just because they are around so long.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we've seen where, because of the stress of captivity,
Mm-hmm.
non-human primates actually fairly frequently, about 10 to 20% of them, become self-destructive.
And doesn't the stress of that situation just nullify any kind of results that you're going to get? This is the argument that I've had with several folks, that just taking that animal into confinement and then putting the stressors on it changes their biology, changes their way their body functions, and therefore any kind of results you're going to get are going to be polluted with the fact that these bodies have been so distorted by their emotional lives and therefore their biology. It just changes. So how can we take any of those conclusions as fact?
Well, you can't. In fact, we once had a set of post-mortem records for a group of primates that were in a facility. We once had them evaluated by a veterinarian.
Mhm.
And the veterinarian told us that those primates were so stressed out by being in captivity that you could not even generalize that data to members of their own species that were living in a natural environment.
Yeah.
Stress changes your physiology that drastically that it makes the data points that come out of it useless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's also important that we look at this from the point of view of the careers of the quote unquote scientists that are participating. It's easier to get an animal based project approved. It's easier to get an animal based project funded because, if nothing else, if there's a problem in the protocol, the rats, mice, and monkeys aren't going to sue you. Because it's easier to get those protocols approved, it's also easier to get things published. Although I think we're seeing some changes in that area as a result of the complaints that we filed, because the and I had mentioned this earlier, but the biggest non-compliance we see is that these researchers go through the trouble of putting together a protocol, getting it approved, and then they don't follow it. And not only is that bad for science, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but research scientists right now are having a problem with the reproducibility of scientific projects. And part of that is because of just this kind of thing, because if you have a publication that says the protocol was done this way, but you didn't follow it, that means no one else can reproduce your results.
Mm-hmm.
And that also means, because you're required to say that you are using an approved protocol and following it, that also means you're guilty of research misconduct.
Right, right. And a lot of these organizations, they're just overseeing themselves. Like the University of Washington has their, I forget the name of the council, but they're overseeing themselves. So it's basically, there is really no accountability.
And they're the ones that are approving the protocols.
Right.
But one of the things we are seeing, and this is something else that gives me more hope, is that I think some of the animal care committees are taking things more seriously than they used to.
Mm.
We had a recent situation where a principal investigator had compliance issues for a number of years, and the animal care committee at this facility didn't just suspend these projects, they permanently terminated all three of them and actually removed this researcher's access to the vivarium building such that they couldn't even come in the building anymore.
Mhm.
That's the kind of thing that we like to see, because that means that these committees are taking these regulations more seriously, and we believe that's going to lead to an end to a lot of animal research just because it's done so poorly.
Mhm. And a waste of their money and a waste of their time and efforts. And then it takes away their credibility.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why we take the step now of, when there are suspended protocols, especially, and we've seen this several times with the same protocols have been suspended multiple times, we start contacting the administration of the university. We get in contact with chancellors and university presidents and say, look, these people are not only violating federal regulations, they're embarrassing your university.
Mhm.
They're making you look like criminals.
Mhm.
And we are hopeful of getting researchers thrown out. In fact, there was one, this was one that we took some particular um, pride in doing. There was a researcher who was at a facility in Florida, and the animal care committee actually did the correct thing. Because there were so many violations, they suspended the project for a year. Well, the principal investigator said, I'm going to get around that, and left the university and went to a different school. The home university tried to get the NIH to share this information with the university that the investigator had transferred to. They refused.
Wow.
However, we got the documents,
Mhm.
and we sent all of the documents about this project being terminated to Rutgers, the new university. They immediately put the investigator on academic suspension,
Hmm.
because, and we don't know for certain, but we're kind of guessing they may have forgotten to mention that the project had been suspended for federal violations.
Right.
They were not allowed to hire staff. They were not even allowed to interact with students.
Wow.
And then by a couple of months later, their name wasn't even on Rutgers' website anymore.
Wow.
We're pretty sure they were terminated,
Wow.
which is exactly what should happen.
Yes. I think it's exactly, and it just shows the power of determination of just bringing these things to light and the fact that they just cannot stay undercover forever, hopefully. The more
Well,
people know, the more they know the situation. I think the more that they can see that this is not okay, and that I think again, going back to that the Beagle Lab recent events, I have all these conversations with, just like, call them civilians on the streets, and they have no idea that people are experimenting on dogs and beagles, and why beagles. I thought this discussion was like moot, like in the 1990s, that everybody understood that this was going on. So I think the work that you're doing, bringing these things to light, is actually shedding so much clarity on folks that just have no idea the depth and the amount of testing that's going on that is so unnecessary.
well, we've seen some other things that we're quite certain our work has had an impact on. For example, I remember when we first got involved back in the 80s, the public opinion polls about animal research said that over 70% of the general public supported animal research, whereas those same kind of polls now demonstrate that over 50% of the American people are opposed to the use of animals in research. But the whole issue of, when we were talking about indirect costs and the cost of grants earlier, this is tax money.
Mhm.
The National Institutes of Health, which is part of the federal government, is the largest single funder of animal research in the US.
Mhm.
And the last somewhat accurate number I saw was that animal research out of the NIH is well over $22 billion a year.
Mhm.
Now, how many people could we provide health care to, or, bring them into Obamacare or something like that for
Mhm.
$22 billion?
Yeah. And I think that the conversation also is difficult because, like, I know my family has a lot of cancer survivors, and they're like, well, we have benefited from these procedures and this data. And it's just such a hard conversation to have with people because they're emotionally involved, but you try to talk to them about how no, it actually has probably set back a lot of this research and a lot of the things that we think are furthering research into cancers and all these diseases. It's actually taking away from the effectiveness because of all these the reasons that you brought up.
Exactly. And there's a quote, and I don't have it memorized, but it's from one of the directors of the National Institutes of Health, and it basically went something to the effect of they had cured cancer in rats and mice dozens and dozens of times, but those cures did not generalize to human beings.
Mhm.
And so as a result, that's just a tremendous waste of taxpayer dollars and potentially people's lives, because while we're putting funding into animal research that could have been going into clinical research for human beings, which actually has the potential to help people right now in the clinical setting, people are dying from treatments that were because of treatments that were never developed because the funding went to the wrong place.
Right. Right. And that's a hard thing to argue with people. It's they don't get it. Like they just don't understand that um the sacrifices that certain beings have taken for furthering science really were wasted. It's just not.
Well, the thing that I always try to do is when you have this kind of a discussion and you're talking about the scientific validity of things, I always start out with just the concept that rats and mice are not just little human beings in fur coats. Their physiology, their anatomy, everything about them is different. And so the way cancer interacts with them physically is different. And that's why you have things like cures for cancer in rats and mice that don't work in people.
Mhm.
But then you have to keep in mind the fact that, as I said earlier, the most common violation we see is people not following their own protocols. If you start out with a situation where you're not using the right research subject to begin with, because clinical research with human beings that have cancer is more effective, but you're starting out with rats and mice because that's easy to get funded and they can't sue you. And then you have a significant number of people not even following their own protocols or not following the regulations that were put in place to ensure both animal welfare and research consistency. The end product that we're getting is so much gobbledygook, which isn't worth the paper it's printed on.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's just on a personal level, how do you guys do this work for so long and keep yourself sane as far as knowing the ultimate like how the numbers of animals that are being exploited and the numbers of little beings that are suffering. I just find it, I mean, I'm sure you guys have these moments where you just can't take it anymore. Like I find as I get older, when I first started out in my 30s and such, and I wanted to know everything about every type of animal exploitation, I feel nowadays I can barely hear about it without it like hitting me so hard. And maybe that's just the times we're living in. But my level of um, of saving myself and feeling like I can go on is so much. I feel so drained, and I see the work that you and Karen have done for decades, and I have so much respect for that because I don't know how you do it on a personal level.
Well, one thing I would say is that if you're going to remain active in this area, you have to avoid information overload
Mhm.
because you can't remember everything about everything.
Mhm.
But then there's also the fact that because we have specialized in a single area, that allows us to be more effective.
Mhm.
Honestly, I consider us to be very lucky in that there's an issue that we're very concerned about. We've been able to be effective in this issue, and that I think is one of the big things that keeps us going because we know that there are laboratories that are closed because of our work. We know that there are researchers who are no longer using animals because of our work. We know, well, even here in Cincinnati, there was a company that was using guinea pigs in testing, and they were literally having these guinea pigs swim around in the kind of chemicals that are used to etch metal. And through targeting this company and going after them and putting public pressure on them, we were able to get this company to switch to a cell culture method that gives them the same, well, not exactly the same information, but information that is acceptable to regulatory bodies because the non-animal methodologies are actually more accurate.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so all of those guinea pigs that were swimming around in highly toxic chemicals, that's not happening anymore. And
So it's the victories that really keep you moving along.
well, they certainly help, but I have to talk about this in a slightly different way. See, you need to remember that we have, and I don't mean just SAEN as an organization, but activists in general have much more of an impact than we are aware of. Because whether you're talking about the animal research issue or factory farming or any other issue that you want to talk about, the fact that we are out there publicizing what goes on and bringing it out into the public forum and making sure that people hear that the research facilities in their area are doing things like not even being able to perform euthanasia correctly. You're not only exposing what's bad about science, but you're damaging the credibility of the institutions and the abuses that you're going after. And we feel very lucky. I feel very lucky because I'm trying to think of how to say this nicely. Every day I get up and come into my desk and decide which researcher we're going after today. Because we don't limit ourselves. We don't say, oh, we're only going after this group of research facilities. And I think this is one of the things that makes us more effective. We don't say this facility is using non-human primates or dogs, and we're going after them because of that. We go after the research facilities that have the most egregious violations because that gives our attacks more credibility and because it allows us to go after them essentially with their own paperwork. We didn't say they violated the regulations. They said it themselves on their own letterhead. And that makes it very difficult for them to argue with what we're saying because we're quoting them.
Wow.
And it's also kind of nice to know that there's some researcher out there that was abusing animals, and that's because that's why we have paperwork about them, that's having a really bad day today because they're the subject of these articles that end up on television or in newspapers,
Mhm.
even in school newspapers. We don't allow them to hide.
Mhm.
And so I know that we've driven many people out of doing animal research. We've closed facilities and we've caused experiments to end.
It's amazing. It's amazing work. And I'm just so happy that you guys are doing the work that you're doing. You were an early inspiration when I decided that anti-vivisection was going to be one of my main focuses because as somebody said to me one day, animals in agriculture, they get to die, but these animals in the labs, they don't necessarily get to die. They suffer for numerous years. And
And,
it's just the suffering is
mm-hmm.
so magnified. And once you just start to get to know these little critters, they just you realize that they have their own. Um,
Well, what you said is true that in many cases, and it's not just non-human primates, other species can be used in laboratories for extended periods of time.
mhm.
And it as much as putting researchers out of business helps to keep us in the fight, all of the information that we deal with, it's things that you can't forget.
Mm.
And I mean, just like from the period when I was inside a research laboratory, there are images that are in my mind forever. When you read things in documents and you hear about a non-human primate that was left in a cage that was sent through the cage washer, and you know that cage washers are things that sterilize with heat, or you read about, and this was something fairly recent, there was a study that was being done on rodents that intentionally caused injuries to their spinal cord, and the researchers knew that that was going to make these animals self-destructive. They knew that this was going to cause self-injurious behavior.
Mhm.
It's difficult enough just knowing that that went on. I don't see how a researcher can actually do that. I don't know how someone can turn their emotions off. And I mean, I understand that because at one point that's what I was doing. I was doing my very best to turn my own emotions off
Mhm.
because it was the only way I could deal with this. But I also found out that that was crippling my activism because I wasn't allowing myself to feel anything.
Mhm.
And when I started allowing myself to feel the sadness and the anger that went along with it, it actually made me into a better activist.
Right, right, right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. Like, I'm just really excited that you're still working and you're still having so many victories. And as you said, like using the facts against these folks to put them out of business is just such a powerful tool that you've managed to wield for a very long time.
Well, it's we believe that we're actually doing God's work in this area because we believe that one of the things people don't know about me very often is that I actually have a degree in theology as well.
Mm.
And one of the concepts that we deal with is this whole idea of stewardship, that we're supposed to be stewards of animals, but people misunderstand that concept
Mhm.
because stewardship doesn't mean you own the animals and you can do with them whatever you wish. Stewardship means that these animals belong to someone else. And in our view, they belong to the being that created them. And so, in protecting and fighting to end the abuse of these animals, we believe we're doing God's work.
Mhm. So thank you so much, Michael, for being with me and talking about the work of Tom Regan and some of the philosophies that sort of guided you in your mission with SAEN.
Reagan is the philosophical basis that I stand on.
I had read his work, but I hadn't really dove into it. And so I think we first started corresponding maybe a month ago. So I've had a deep dive into all that dwell within, and it really has shed a different light on things for me. So I really thank you for that. And that's part of this purpose of this podcast is sort of to shed light on different, it could be popular culture, it could be something really in depth like philosophy, but it's just shedding a new light on the way that we interact and view non-human animals and our place in the world and our relationship to them. So I really appreciate the work that you do. And thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael.